Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Science, the Press, and the Public, Working with Authors to Convey Research Results, which is sponsored by the American Association for the Advancement of Science and Science. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, the structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a couple of features of the webinar software. For all of you listening in out there, please know that when you join the presentation, you are automatically muted and your cameras are disabled. So don't worry about generating noise or feedback or strange visuals. We've got that taken care of. In the main area of the screen as well, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. And as far as the Q&A goes, today we do have that feature open. So please use it to ask questions of our speakers. And if you see a question that you'd like to second, you can upvote that question using the little thumbs up icon in the Q&A module. At the end of the presentation, we'll take time to answer as many as we can get to. So again, please do feel free to add your questions to that Q&A module throughout the presentation. And also note that we are recording today's program and that everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. All right, and so with that, I will just take a second to turn things over to Elizabeth Leonard from AAAS to introduce today's speaker.
Hi, everyone. I am Elizabeth Leonard. I am the Associate Director for Research and Development at AAAS Science. And I worked in academic libraries for about 15 years before moving to publishing. And I'm quite excited at today's talk and today's speaker. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you Colin O'Connor. Over the last 4 years, Colin has helped connect authors of research published in the science family of journals and the authors' affiliated press officers connect with reporters from around the world. Amongst other work, Colin drives accurate news coverage by authoring contextualized summaries of forthcoming studies and moderates discussions between high-profile authors and the public. He recently received his master's degree in science writing from Johns Hopkins University, and congratulations, Colin, for that. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Colin.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Let me share my screen here just to get the presentation up for all of you. So hopefully that is working. Looks good. Great. All right. So yes, as Elizabeth said, I'm going to be talking to you today about how we at the science family of journals work with the press and work with publishing scientists to convey their research findings out to the public. And I'll get to this a little more deeply in a few minutes, but we really find this to be imperative. The stakes are pretty high here, and we really take pride in how we've been able to innovate and how we work diligently week in and week out to get these findings out to the public as broadly and, more importantly, as accurately as possible. So I'm really excited to share with you what we've come up with here. Like I said, what you'll learn today, how we work with the scientists publishing in our journals how we work with them to communicate their findings to the press, what the press is looking for, and how we try to marry their needs with our needs and the needs of the scientists. And then lastly, because I'm sure you'll find it interesting, how the coronavirus pandemic has kind of changed the landscape for us. So to start, when I was in middle school, I learned the scientific method. I'm sure you all did also. That's how you answer questions scientifically. There's you ask a question, you research, you develop a hypothesis, come up with an experiment. And the last step is always communicate your findings. So communicating what you found is a really critical, integral part of the scientific endeavor. And that's usually thought of as publishing in a journal. But that really only reaches one kind of audience. It reaches other scientists, which is important so they can build on your work and check your work. But there are many, many other people, basically everybody else, who also kind of need to know what's going on in your field in order to make health decisions, in order to make decisions about raising their children, who to vote for, that kind of thing. And especially among these people who need to know are lawmakers. This is a photo of Rush Holt. He's a former congressman from New Jersey, my home state. And he, until very recently, was the CEO of AAAS. And Rush said to us, when I was in Congress, congressmen told me they read news pieces on new research, not the research itself. That seems kind of like a mundane thing to say, but there are real legislative decisions being made based on the secondary journalistic coverage of the science. So that should really draw into focus how important news coverage is in addition to the actual journal publication. So that's why at Science we have our journals, and we also have the press package team. So the press package team works on all 6 of the Science family journals. You can see the journal names listed at the top there. There are 5 writers who read papers being published in upcoming issues of these journals each week, and then translate them into about 250-word lay language summaries that contextualize the research and put it in terms that a generalist reporter could understand quickly. We also have 4 communications associates. Those are the ones, I'm a communications associate. I communicate with the authors, communicate with the press, and make sure that we're kind of gathering everything we can to make it as easy as possible for reporters to cover this stuff accurately. And then we produce 5 press packages online every week. These are web pages that journalists can go to before the paper is published during the embargo period, which I'll talk about in a moment. And here's what they look like. So on the left here, you can see this is a screenshot of the index of our Science Advances press package. You can see the title of the summaries, the first couple lines of the summaries that our writers wrote. You can see that there are images associated with these papers, and journalists can come to this webpage. We have over 6,000 journalists that are registered with us that are able to access this. They can read the summary, they can download a proof of the paper, they can get these images and videos that we've collected. That globe icon under the top one indicates that there is translation in one or more languages of our summary, in case we want to get coverage in other countries. If a research institution has issued a press release, we can also tag that on to our press package. So it's really made to be kind of a one-stop shop for journalists to come and learn much of what they need to know to cover this paper before it's published. So our press package is sent to reporters on Sunday night Eastern time. The idea being that when they get to work Monday morning, it's at their desk and they can figure out what they want to cover that week. They have between 2 and 5 days before the research is actually published and released to the public. When it's under embargo, that gives them time to kind of tease apart the complexities of this research and contact the scientists involved and really kind of do all the nitty-gritty research that they need to do in order to cover this stuff accurately. And then on the right here, you can see the product of our efforts. This is a news article by Damian Carrington. He is at The Guardian. He's registered with us, and he has covered this piece on the left. If you look at the third entry down, Himalayan ice loss doubled in recent years, Cold War era spy satellite data reveal. So you can see it going from our press package out into the world on The Guardian in this case. And then once the embargo has been lifted and the research is out into the world, we ask the scientists how we did. And this is what they say, that they got more media coverage than expected. Often the media coverage was more accurate than they expected. They were able to clarify misconceptions. They were able to connect with new collaborators. Sometimes this even connects them with policymakers or gets them invited to congressional committees, or they can speak testify before Congress. And so we love to see that, and this is all very encouraging, especially in the face of the current realities of newsrooms. There are a lot of local publications drying up and disappearing. The ones that are surviving are often downsizing a lot. The science desk is often one of the first desks to go when a news outlet needs to downsize. And there is a lot of competition for people's attention. And then specifically for science coverage, this stuff is hard to cover. It takes a lot of time to get covered accurately. Not all journalists have the expertise required to cover it accurately. That's especially true during coronavirus, when there are many more journalists covering this very complex scientific topic. And so this is kind of the reality that we're working with, that newspapers have these challenges that they need to work with that make it much more difficult to cover science. And this is especially concerning given that, like I said earlier, about half of American adults get their science news from general news outlets. So once you're out of school, much of what you're learning from science is coming from probably news outlets. And only a third of American adults think that these sources get their science facts correct most of the time. So that's a pretty alarming statistic, right? That people who are making health decisions based on this, raising their children based on this, voting based on this, they're getting it from sources that they don't actually quite trust. And I want to look at a couple headlines that we've seen that kind of show how news outlets don't always, their incentives to get page views don't always align with the nuances of these scientific discoveries. On the left, this news story, horns are growing on young people's skulls, phone use is to blame, research suggests. That's not really actually what the research suggested. Eyeglasses may help protect against coronavirus. That study also was done in a very small population of people who were already hospitalized. It's not especially generalizable. Wearing a neck gaiter may be worse than no mask at all, researchers find. So this one was actually one of our studies. It was published in Science Advances, and the Science Advances team really worked diligently to convey that paper was not looking at necessarily how well neck gaiters perform at blocking coronavirus particles, but it was the study was done to develop a new way of testing different kinds of masks. So the neck gaiter data was very preliminary, and perhaps it might be confirmed by future studies, but we didn't really want that to be the bottom line of that paper. And we were very pleased that the kind of first round of coverage did really get it right. And then the follow-on coverage, often when a paper is very popular, outlets that had not yet covered it will kind of follow on and also want to cover it. That's when that headline started to pop up. So and there are real consequences to those bad headlines. They kind of trickled down throughout social media. Sikan Akpan, he was at PBS NewsHour at the time. He is now, I believe he's an editor at National Geographic now. He estimated that Horn's study, which did not actually look at phone use at all, that headline was not really accurate to the findings of the study, that at least 30 million social media users were exposed to that headline. So whether they read the article, hard to say, whether they even read the headline and registered it, hard to say, but that's a lot. And that's a lot of people who might be making future health decisions based on something that isn't really quite the story. So in our registration questionnaire, we asked what the worst headline you've seen this year was, and we got a lot of good answers, mostly about coronavirus. There was one kind of verbatim headline someone sent in: human coronaviruses inactivated by mouthwash and oral rinses, and that was in Fox News. And that's not necessarily what you want to be saying to people based on that study. That in that paper, they I think they cultured the virus in like kidney cells and then submerged it in mouthwash, and that killed the virus. But using mouthwash is not really going to protect you from getting the coronavirus. That's not really the message we want getting out. And so that our need to get this stuff covered accurately, I think, is what makes us different from a PR firm, for instance. We would really prefer this research not get covered at all if it's not going to be covered accurately. So to that end, we spend a lot of time thinking about what it is about the news media that makes science so tricky to cover. What are the problems in science communication that we can focus on and help scientists work on in order to help journalists cover things more accurately? And the biggest problems that we've identified are kind of on two ends of a spectrum. A lot of research gets hyped up to make it more sensational, kind of more exciting, make it a better story. Journalists and editors especially want punchy headlines. They want punchy findings that are going to get them a lot of clicks on social media. And then on the other end of the pendulum, more basic research gets ignored often. So very incremental findings about how one enzyme behaves in a very specific situation, that's not especially attention grabbing for average readers. And so journalists and editors tend to not focus on those studies. But that incremental kind of research is most of science. And we think it's important for the public to kind of understand that that's how science works. So our challenge is kind of to tamp down the hype of the more eye-catching findings, and also to boost the visibility of the more basic incremental research. So our efforts are to say no to hype. We, in our summaries that we write, we kind of temper our language, temper our headlines to say things responsibly, not to overstate the implications. We try to give as much context as possible, what other studies have been done in this field, how has the news covered it in the past, and we call it the limitations. Was the study just done in a mouse, or was it done in just a handful of people? A lot of HIV and AIDS research I've noticed often there are only 4 human subjects or 6 human subjects involved. Those are study limitations that we really try to call out and put front and center in front of the journalists who are going to cover them, so that when they do cover them, it's accurate and contextualized. This next slide is kind of just for fun. This is a Twitter account that is after our own heart. It's called Just Says and Mice. You can find them on Twitter, and they tweet out news coverage of scientific research, like this one from the Daily Mail that says vaping does raise the risk of breast cancer, warn scientists. That study found that in mice. It did not find that in humans. And if you're familiar with biomedical research, you know that it is a long road from mouse research to human research. And those are the kinds of limitations that we really want to make front and center. And I'll talk a little bit more about our successes with that approach in a moment. But I want to tell you a little bit about the actual things that we do with the scientists pre-publication. We encourage them to put video together. Journalists love video and they love images. And if there is kind of a striking visual element to a research finding, if there are good pictures and good video, they're more likely to choose to cover that. Especially video that contextualizes the paper, talks about what the paper does not say. We love it when they're able to put those together for us, often working with their press office at their university or wherever they might be. There's an outlet called The Conversation. Maybe some of you have heard of it. It's a news outlet, basically, where academics can write about their own research in more of a journalistic style, so they don't need to adhere to the conventions of scientific writing, like writing for a journal. They can kind of talk more about what they think the implications will be, where they think the research is going. They can kind of tailor it more to a lay audience, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But they can write for the conversation, and then their pieces in the conversation get syndicated out to other news outlets, so it really spreads out their message. We also encourage them to make infographics, tell us a bit about the personalities behind the research, the people leading the study. Often there's a really interesting story there. We can help them engage with local reporters. Something I forgot to mention on our press package, you can actually search the papers by location. So if you're by location of the scientists doing the research. So if you're a local reporter, you can see, who in your city is working on science that's about to be published. And we also do teleconferences where journalists can call in and ask questions, much identical to a press conference. We do it over the phone usually. And this is all pre-publication, usually during that embargo period. And then post-publication, we continue our efforts, largely on social media. One of my favorite things to do are Facebook Lives, where we invite the researchers to sit for an interview with us live, while people who follow us on Facebook can write in with their questions, and they have an opportunity to respond to these questions, clarify misconceptions. We've got a lot of really great feedback on those. They're a lot of fun to do. And AAAS also has a service called Sciline, where generalist reporters can call in and be connected with an expert in a scientific field that they might be covering. And so we encourage scientists that are publishing with us to maybe offer to be an expert on hand for journalists in the future. Now, these efforts we've seen a lot of success with. I want to talk a little bit about how we are able to tamp down the hype and how that can be successful. This was a paper published in Science Advances, our open access journal, in 2018, called Evidence for a Large Exomoon Orbiting Kepler 1625b. So this, exomoons, exoplanets, always very exciting, always get a lot of pickup in the news. And in this paper, there was a lot of uncertainty around the finding, and the scientists acknowledged that. And we wanted to make sure that when it was covered in the news, that uncertainty was conveyed. And so the Science Advances arm of the press package team asked these scientists to make a video talking about what the paper does not say. The summary itself talked a lot about the study limitations and the uncertainty. And what we found is that the uncertainty kind of became the story. The uncertainty is interesting to reporters and to their readers. And so conveying, we found an exomoon is exciting. we maybe found an exomoon is not as exciting, maybe, but if you talk about the uncertainty in a way that's interesting, it can actually be really enticing to reporters. It did not steer the press away at all. You can see the altmetric score down in the left corner there. I don't know how many of you are familiar with altmetric. It's a service that tracks the impact of papers based on their news coverage and their social media coverage. Basically, if people are tweeting the links or if it's getting picked up in the news a lot, it gives you kind of an at a glance sense of how many people are talking about the paper. And it's one of the tools we use to track news coverage. And you can see with this paper, it was published in, news coverage of this paper was published in 318 news outlets. And that's really good. And so that's how we've found that tamping down the hype can actually itself be successful. And addressing the other issue that I talked about earlier of basic science not getting covered can also be really successful. When we're talking to journalists about more basic findings, they are often interested in how, kind of a smaller incremental finding contributes to a trend. So we are trying to track research trends that, if a paper is coming out and it is fairly incremental, can we pair it with an older paper or with a simultaneous paper that gives a better sense of kind of the thrust that this field is going in. We go to a lot of scientific meetings and conventions and talk to scientists on the phone to learn about what is happening in their field, so that when we get these kind of less eye-catching studies, we'll know how does this sit in the kind of general direction of the field, so that when we share it with reporters, we can tell them the context that it's being published in. And we think about other newsworthy elements of more basic research. Often the finding itself we think is important, but might not be that eye-catching. So there can be other newsworthy parts of the story that can be kind of the spoonful of sugar that get people to read about it. So if, like I said, if a scientist that was working on the research has a very interesting personal story, or if the research wouldn't have been done but for some new technology that just came out, or if it was done, we had a paper, I think it was a geology paper done in, I might be mistaken about this, but done in North Korea, a usually inaccessible place for scientists, but that itself is an interesting element of the story. That paper from a few slides back of glaciers receding, the data from that came from spy satellites. Like, that's interesting. So those are kind of the other elements that might be paired with a finding that make the finding more interesting to reporters and thus more interesting to readers. So we're always thinking about the different angles a story can be viewed from. There's the finding itself. What does this paper actually say? There's the way the finding affects the field. How are other scientists going to respond to it, and how is it going to change their research? And then there's, how does the finding affect me, the public? And so those different angles are interesting to different degrees to reporters, to other scientists, to the public. So we're always kind of thinking about how best to present the research from those different angles. And that's one of the things we think about when we ask scientists to pitch to the conversation, that outlet I was talking about earlier. The conversation gives them an opportunity to talk about their research from an angle other than just, what is your data, what is the finding, which is what they publish in the journal. in the conversation, they can zoom out a little bit or focus on a specific aspect of it. And we've had a lot of success with this. This was here we have a paper that was published in Science Immunology called Heterogeneity and Clonal Relationships of Adaptive Immune Cells in Ulcerative Colitis Revealed by Single Cell Analysis. One of the authors, the senior author on that paper, wanted to write kind of a more journalistic angle, from a more journalistic angle about this research for the conversation. He pitched his idea to them. They published it, and it was syndicated out to a number of local outlets. And it wound up getting the most news coverage in 2020 of any Science Immunology paper that was not about coronavirus. So coronavirus obviously is creating a lot of noise for other areas of research that it can be hard to break above. But as you can see here, here's a list of all the local outlets that syndicated, IBD, how a class of killer T cells goes rogue. That headline appeared in many, many outlets because they syndicated it out from the conversation. And so this research got a lot of eyeballs on it thanks to that. And the scientists themselves liked the conversation. This is from a survey that they presented in 2019. Scientists are approached for collaborations they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. They're approached for interviews. They get more citations. So it makes scientists happy, it makes us happy, and it makes news outlets happy because they can get this content. Now I'm going to shift for a moment to coronavirus stuff, because I'm sure you're all interested in that, and in how that's kind of changed things for us and some of the differences we're seeing at our journals. So you can see from this table, almost 10% of submissions to our journals in 2020 have been about coronavirus. About 4% of those have been accepted. I'll talk a bit about how the journals and the kind of editorial arm of the journals are treating those differently. As far as we're concerned with the press package, one unique factor about coronavirus research is that a greater proportion of these papers have already been published as preprints. And I'm not sure if you're all familiar with preprints, but these are basically web pages where scientists can upload their data, and they can write up a paper and publish it basically as soon as they have it, without needing to go through the editorial process and the peer review process. So it gets their data out in front of people very quickly, but with the drawback of not getting peer review and editing by the editors that you would get at a journal. So one of the big questions we've been asking in this environment with preprints is the journal, and are we as the press package team still adding value if the data might be out there already? If they publish it online and it's out, are we still, do they still find value in publishing with an actual journal? And we think the reason there's a higher proportion of preprints for coronavirus papers is because there is this attitude of wanting to get this stuff out as quickly as possible and solve this. So it's something we sympathize with, and we don't necessarily want to put a stop to. As far as the journal is concerned, early in the pandemic, we signed on to the Welcome Rapid Data Sharing Agreement. So everything about coronavirus that we publish is immediate release, meaning that there's no embargo period. We don't tell journalists a few days before we tell everyone else. Journalists find out the moment everybody else does. It gets published, and we send an email to journalists. And everything is free. You don't need to be a subscriber or a member of AAAS in order to read this research on our webpage if it's coronavirus. On editorial side, they are reviewing faster, but all these other points here are basically true of any research that they would cover. So really the faster review is the biggest change of how they're treating coronavirus papers specifically. And for our part in the press package, our communications efforts are also accelerated. We are still writing these press summaries. We're holding teleconferences, Facebook Lives, and all that. And from what we found, scientists are still, even if they've published on a preprint, they are still finding a lot of value in the experience that they're getting from science. This is a quote from an author. You can see down in the corner, that's the preprint. So that's what went up online before the actual journal publication. They say that when they published with us, the visibility expanded massively, gave them a stamp of approval. They were able to enter into policy and mainstream conversation almost immediately. And one thing we're concerned about is if the research is out there already, are journalists still going to want to cover it as news if it's kind of out in the world already? And journalists are actually, not actually, I should say, they're all very smart. They're very keen to this difference between if research is peer reviewed and if it's not. And so when a paper comes out and it's published by a journal that is able to do peer review, that it doesn't seem to deter coverage if that research was already out in the world as a preprint. So we're glad to see that that's happening. We still have coronavirus papers coming in all the time. We're still working on them very rapidly. And so far it looks like our efforts are paying off. So we're very proud about that. And that's about all I've got for you. I know, Elizabeth, I don't know if any questions have come in. If you've been holding any questions until now, feel free to send them in. But yeah, I'm happy to address whatever you've got.
Thank you very much, Colin. We do have a couple questions for you. The first of which is, doesn't the idea of putting more of a spotlight on incremental research come up against the type of research that ends up getting published by the flagship journals like Science? The journals that publish the incremental research do not have the money or the people to work with the press and scientists to get the incremental work covered and covered well.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So Science is the kind of our flagship journal and does kind of get the maybe flashier headlines. Everything that I've talked about, and perhaps I should have made this clear, is for all of our journals, including our smaller ones like Science Immunology, Science Translational Medicine, which do see more of that incremental research. So we are kind of working with our smaller journals. I work on immunology and robotics specifically, and you know, we would hope that this kind of creates an environment in which journalists are able to cover more incremental research in other journals. You know, we certainly don't want to silence coverage of smaller outlets. So I hope that answers your question.
And if it doesn't, Samuel, please write back in, we'll revisit.
Yeah, sure.
So your next question, Colin, is, and I'll put this into the perspective of the press, how do you deal with COVID articles or preprints that have to be retracted?
That's a good question, perhaps one for Megan.
I can answer the
Sure.
journals side of it.
Mhm.
So just so everybody is aware, on the journals pages themselves, we use something called Retraction Watch, and we're very public with the fact that a paper has been retracted and why it's been retracted on our journals site. Megan, how much do you work with the press once something's been retracted?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And in the spirit of transparency, we communicate about all species of update to a paper after it's been published. So we will put a notification in our press package, just as we would for a new paper, about a retraction, about a technical comment. Any follow-up to a final version, we send a notification to reporters to explain what it was about. And in the case of a retraction, we'll indicate if it's an author retraction or an editorial retraction. We'll make sure we have media contacts in the form of the authors who are available to talk about it. And we'll make sure that our editor-in-chief is available to answer questions too. So we want to be as transparent as possible. We usually publish about 3 to 5 retractions a year. And in each case, we're communicating to the press proactively about them. Great question.
And honestly, I'm very proud of the fact that we don't hide that we have retracted papers. Your next question, Colin, is, are there any consequences if a journalist you work with publishes an article that misrepresents the research?
Consequences, no, and I don't think that that's something that we want to be in the business of necessarily. We do reach out to them. I know that Megan has done a lot of work reaching out to reporters or even editors of outlets that we think kind of might misrepresent a finding. We're not, I don't, and Megan, maybe you have more to say about this, but I don't know that we want to necessarily be in the business of kind of policing the media post publication.
And
go ahead, Megan.
before you respond, Megan, let me just maybe reframe it, which is, I believe Colin said that there are, what, 6,000 journalists that received the press package. How do they get access? And then why would you or would you not recertify them to have access?
So the reporters who are registered with us are registered through Eurekalert, which is a website that issues press releases for scientific research. And Eurekalert has their own kind of vetting process for when a journalist registers with them. If they have covered a certain amount of scientific news regularly enough, they're able to register. As far as I know, the only reason their registration might be revoked is if they're breaking embargoes early. Megan, do you have more to say about that?
Yeah, that would, so any reporter who dared publish a story before the embargo, after having signed on to Eurekallert's embargo agreement, would be someone who would be first given a warning. And would there be a second case of a violation within a certain period, Eurekalert would revoke that access. But one of the ways that we try to get at quality of coverage and assess it, because we can't read all the science news ourselves, is to survey our authors. About a week after their papers have been published, we ask them, what did you think about the quality of coverage and the range, both geographically and in terms of diversity of outlet? And we hear pretty positively from authors whose papers are being covered in that first week. So from authors who where reporters are relying on our press package materials. Now, derivative coverage after that, where reporters perhaps not registered with us are looking at other coverage and writing stories, that coverage can look different, and we don't track it as closely, I would say.
Thank you both. Okay, so Samuel did come back and explain his question a little bit more. So are you ready, Colin?
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. He says, I should have been more specific. The whole portfolio of science has backing and is more likely to get flashy headlines than the workhorse journals that do most of the publishing in science, little s science, and most of the incremental science for sure. How can we expect the incremental nature of science across, since these workhorse journals definitely do not have press offices. And as a side note, I wonder if you can speak to how you work with the press officers at the organizations that employ the researchers, and maybe that can help express that.
Megan, you had something to say?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Samuel, from the University of Michigan, I believe. Yeah, so the short answer to that question is that we think we have taken several years to innovate and develop and refine what we are doing at the Press Package at Science. And we are doing it after having talked to dozens of reporters and researchers in different fields and press officers across the globe. Most recently, many of them in Japan, as one example. We don't imagine that every journal can do what we can do, but one of the reasons we want to give talks like this is so that some of the ideas that Colin's communicating. For example, any researcher can pitch to the conversation, or researchers can hold on to that list of surprisingly newsworthy elements and identify those elements in their stories and pitch themselves. We want to give these talks so that other people affiliated with other journals can use some of the techniques that we're using. Now, we do, to Elizabeth's point, we do talk to press officers who are affiliated with the research papers that we're publishing a week or 2 weeks in advance of every paper. And we give them guidance and insight as well. They too, in so many cases, have terrific ideas for how to promote research well. So it may not matter what journal someone is working with. If your press office, as so many are, have insights into how to do this, they can propel the study to coverage in the right outlets and in the right way.
Okay, your next question is, do the reporters usually link to the original article in the science journals in their news article? Do they provide a citation? I found some articles in the press to not include enough information for me to find the original article.
We very much want them to. They don't always. But I think Megan has in the past reached out and asked certain reporters to start adding them. I think reporters and editors have their reasons for not always wanting to, but it's in our best interest as a journal, and I think it's in readers' best interest to get those links. And for the most part, we do see a lot of that. But it's not something we have complete control over.
Okay, and then how can researchers not associated with a university or research facility use your services? A colleague engineer is doing crash testing of horse trailers and the injuries done to horses. Where would this find a home within your services?
That's a good question. I know, and Megan, maybe you can speak more to this, but I should mention I'm talking directly from the press package from the journals. AAAS does have a lot of services for training scientists for how to engage with the press, even if they're not publishing with us. So I think we do have ability to help in that respect. As for where to publish it, I'm not sure if I can answer that. Megan, do you have anything?
Well, your first point was right on. The AAAS Public Engagement Group hosts regular workshops, and they train people in how to communicate science at an even more granular level than we're doing here, with some really good tips. Again, I would say that anyone who hears this talk could pick up some of the ideas that we're presenting, and particularly those about scientists proactively communicating to press. We hear from some reporters that many greatly value the press package, but some of them just love to be pitched to directly by scientists and prefer it. So taking advantage of that angle is really important and can work out for many scientists, I would say.
And if you want specifics of those public engagement trainings, feel free to send me an email, and I can figure out who to put you in touch with.
Okay, and then what is science doing in terms of reaching diverse audiences?
That's a really good question, and it's something that we've been thinking a lot about, especially recently. We have when journalists register with us, we send them a questionnaire that helps us pitch to them. So, if we'll know what their beat is, if they cover volcanoes and we have a good volcano paper, we'll reach out to them. We've recently put on a couple questions about the journalist's own identity, or if the journalist is interested in covering kind of identity-based issues, diversity-based issues. So that's one of our efforts here in the press office. I know the journal itself also has some initiatives that I don't know the nuts and bolts on. Megan, do you have anything?
Yeah, so the front end of the journal, editorial policy forum perspective, there is a very hard focus right now on representing issues related to diversity in STEM. On Thursday this week, you'll see an editorial that's squarely in this space, and that's one of many in recent months and even in recent years. We are also looking for ways to help diverse voices. Maybe these are middle authors in the author lists, communicate their perspective on the science and their contribution to the science. And sometimes, even as they are not listed as the corresponding author, we will reach out to them and ask them how they might want to be involved, or if there's a unique angle on the research that they could talk about. So we're trying to do more of this. The journal Science is also it's publicly communicated its data about author diversity, what we're seeing, and also editor and reviewer diversity. And we're thinking about all these things so we can be accountable to them and make improvements. The AAAS website features a report that was published on October 30th that lists this diversity information.
And I know, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Just really quickly on the institutional licensing side, we do participate in something called Research for Life. And so while Science and almost all of the Science family of journals are subscription journals, with the exception of Science Advances, for countries in lesser advantaged economies, we provide access through Research for Life to our journals. Okay, Colin, I have a completely random question for you, and it's my own.
Sure.
How the heck did you get involved in doing this anyway?
Well, Megan, well, I should say, so I studied biology in college. I was always interested in science, but when I graduated college and I started working in a lab, I realized that I was less interested in the lab notebooks and Excel spreadsheets, and more interested in kind of the centrifuges and kind of like the cool stories. I really liked talking about science and writing about science more than actually doing it, which is for, I think, another kind of person. And so I wanted to keep contributing, and so I got interested in science writing, and that's why I came to AAAS. I recently, you mentioned earlier, Elizabeth, that I just did my my master's in science writing, and I find it's just a really kind of stimulating field. Turning these very esoteric or nuanced or complex ideas into stories, which I think is how humans organize reality in their mind. And I think it's a really fun puzzle for every paper, turning it into a fun story.
Oh, I like that phrase, how we organize things and make reality in our own minds. I think there was an information scientist who wrote a paper on, and the librarians that can correct me, I think it was Brenda Dervin who coined the phrase sense making, and how much we have a natural tendency to try to find patterns and make sense out of what we see. And it is a bit like what you're talking about.
Yeah, I kind of think of it like colors, how colors like don't really exist physically. They're kind of how our brains make sense of the world. I feel like stories don't really exist. You know, the reality is more chaotic than that, but it's how we understand. And so, you know, if we can put things in terms of stories, it's easier to learn.
Mm. And maybe why video and the popularity of video helps too.
Mm.
Yeah. I think when you were showing what the journalists see when they come onto the site, it showed, you think you called it the globe.
Mm.
And so there are some of the pieces that have been translated. How is that decided?
So the journals that I work on often don't have translations. So Megan, do you want to talk about the how when you decide to do a translation?
Yeah, so we surveyed reporters at different milestones over the years. And right now we are translating top papers that we feel are the most newsworthy into the languages that our reporters around the world are saying they would like translations in most. These are Spanish, Chinese, and Japanese. I should also add that we have a very popular and important Spanish language Twitter account that is focused on communicating breaking research news to Spanish speaking journalists. And that has been a really important resource. The journalists who comment on its utility are saying that it's filling a major gap. But the way that we've been deciding what to translate is derivative of what the reporters in our registrant base are saying that they want most of. And we do it for the top papers at Science, Science Advances, and Science Translational Medicine. So our 3 oldest journals. And we might expand and do more of that as resources permit.
And I know that it's not the press packages account, but our AAAS Science WeChat account in China is incredibly popular. And it is one of the other ways that we get information out in the native language to another country. So Mark had the nerve to ask a question. So Mark wanted to know, does publishing open access, for example, the Science Advances articles, impact press pickup, or is there an appreciable difference between the articles that are covered by the news media that are published in open access journals versus our subscription journals?
Yeah, I don't think so. Reporters, because they see all of the content in the same way, it's all in the embargoed press package. It all looks the same to them. Whatever is in Science, whatever is in Science, which is a subscription journal, whatever is in Science Advances, which is open, it all looks the same. So we haven't noticed any difference in Science Advances content because it's open, getting more or different coverage. I don't think it matters so much to reporters. They still build the link into their story no matter which journal it's coming from. But it's a really good question, and we might study it more down the line.
And then I think this is going to need to be our last question as I look at the time, which is, how can researchers not associated, oh no, we already asked that one, which was the how do we get it, help for people who aren't necessarily our published authors. So Colin, Megan, any last words for the audience?
Do you have something, Megan?
Well, I was just going to say, if you all see headlines and stories that you think missed the mark on Science Family Research, please send them our way so we can contact that reporter and outlet, see if we can have a good conversation about what happened there. And thank you, Colin. This was terrific.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth, for that very kind introduction, and to Mark and Sabrina for putting this all together. And thanks everyone for watching. I hope you learned something. I hope it's helpful to you in whatever capacity you need it. This is something I love to do. I hope that, you'll look at science news coverage in a different light now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Colin. On behalf of ACRL and Choice, we really appreciate your taking the time to present to our audience. and to answer a whole bunch of questions on the fly. That can always be interesting. So we really appreciate you doing that. And I would just take a moment to say thank you to those out there joining us today. We appreciate your taking the time to do so. We hope to see you on another webinar in the near future. And as we sign out today, you should be directed to a brief survey. If you could take a minute to fill that out to give us a bit of feedback, we would really appreciate that. It's valuable insight into how the presentation went and to what you're thinking. So we really appreciate it. Once again, thanks everybody. We'll hope to see you again real soon.